want to speak. All right. Yes, please. It is 9:34. We will go ahead and call to order the Technical Advisory Committee for March 18th. And we'll start with roll call. Steve Bicking.
Here.
Mike Lumberg will not be here. Al Schmidt.
Here.
Mike Warner.
Here.
Jody McCarthy. Pete Manhard. Okay, Brian Valesky.
Present.
Dan Volkers.
Here.
Lori Ryan.
Here.
Dan Ziller, Seth. Okay, Scott.
Here.
Spring.
Here.
Ernest.
Here in the place that Spring told me to sit.
Derek. Do we get that on the record?
Yes.
Somebody probably told you where to sit. Yes, I went to sit right where Tyler is, and I tapped Spring on the shoulder. I said, "May I sit here?" She said, "No, absolutely not. You have to sit where I can see your face." She thought I was making noises or faces or something behind her last 3 months. I don't know.
Darren.
Here.
All right. Brad.
Here.
Tyler.
Still low.
All right, we have quorum. All right, we'll go ahead and move into item number 2, minutes approval of our last meeting from February 18th. If there's any discussion or any comments from anyone, do I hear any?
I move to accept them.
Oh, okay, we have a motion to accept the comments
I'll
or the
second.
minutes, apologies, second by Spring. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, any opposed? The ayes have it. Okay, there's no public comment. Any members' comments today? Anyone say anything? Okay. All right, so we'll move into the only agenda item that I had for today, which is discussion on our kind of a previous topic that we started on, which is detention. So what I tried to do without getting too much into it was kind of develop here. One, I placed the ordinance or the SMO related to the runoff rate reduction here for you guys. So it goes through the different threshold triggers, some of the exemptions. And then I did include a little bit extra for the release rates that I wanted to get into as part of this discussion. So I went and I compiled, or I took a look at some of the other counties and just tried to give a quick summary of what others are doing, what our ordinance has, just so we have those comparisons. So obviously for us, 20,000 square foot trigger, there's a couple of exemptions there for an additional 1 acre or an additional 5%. Lake County, so this is maybe where I'll rely to maybe some Lake County folks, but it wasn't exactly clear to me, unless I was misunderstanding, but it appeared to be a 1/2 acre of impervious unless it was deemed that it was a major development, then you have to provide an analysis on the runoff.
There's 3 triggers. It's 1/2 an acre if it's going to cause your site to be greater than 50% impervious. 1 acre of impervious, or 3 acres?
Of hydrologically disturbed area unless the new impervious is below a 1/2 acre.
Yeah.
So is it about a 1/2 acre for all
They're
intents and
1/2 acre, 1 acre.
Well, because the thing that I found interesting was if your development under Lake County is tagged as a major development, it looked like you still needed to go through the process and provide the stormwater calculations, unless I'm incorrect in that. That's the way that I read it. If the enforcement officer deems your site as a major development, you have to provide the tributary areas and all of that goes along with it.
You'd have to do that study analysis, but you wouldn't necessarily need detention unless you tripped one of those 3 thresholds.
Okay, so even if the study analysis potentially maybe shows that it might be required based on that, you still wouldn't need it?
No.
Okay.
No, you have to
All
trip.
right, so 1/2 an acre. Kane County was 25,000. Or hydrologically disturbed areas greater than 3 acres. DuPage County was 25. So that's basically about a 1/2 acre. And then DuPage did have the similar 1 acre exemption, not similar, but a 10% of the development site, which is kind of what we have, we went to 5. So those are the other counties in terms of the triggers. So what staff and I tried to do was give some context and run some different hydroflow analysis, and this is where potentially the engineers in the room, I tried to keep it simple. Don't kill us on, if we didn't run something quite how it's needed. But I just, for a visual, I just picked a random site just to show potentially like if this site itself is 77 acres here. But what I wanted to show was this was basically the tributary area if this was considered, a new development, or if we consider this was about a half acre in here. So if we consider this area to be potentially, that half acre of impervious. And so there is kind of a ditch that flows through here. So the whole southern half would really, it's separated, okay? So that's kind of the one that we started with. The reason why we picked that one was because it has a longer flow path. So we wanted to see kind of what happens under the longer flow path scenario. And so for the engineers in the room, you'll be familiar with the hydrographs. So that's in your packet there. I'm going to go back up to the summary because it's going to be a little bit easier just to show. So we ran that 13 acres of trib, assumed a composite curve number of about 86, so you can see the inputs there. We chose 85 just based on the curve number tables. It seemed to kind of, for these type of areas, range between like 82 to 87 type of thing. So again, there's nothing specific about the 85. We just chose to run with one. So the peak flow is about 11.5 CFS. There's the volume of runoff, time of concentration. So what we did then was we said, okay, if that's the existing condition, I'll go back to the area real quick. And again, I just said in the existing, you've already got about a half acre of impervious. If we were to add another half acre off the back here, let's say, what is that going to look like? What is that going to do essentially? So peak basically stayed the same. Volume of runoff basically stayed the same. The composite. So what it showed was essentially there was not a lot of change because of that long flow path and tributary area. And then we just bumped it up to an acre just to show what that would look like. And so again, the peak flow runoff went up a little bit, about a 13% increase in the amount of runoff that we're seeing there. So those are just some of the numbers. What we then looked at was, and again, this is the concept of everyone saying, well, I'm on 80 acres, why do I need to provide detention? So the other scenario we looked at is if you have a site, and I can't remember the total acreage on this one, I think it was about 10. But vacant area, but what happens when you put it right next to, where you're going to be at a neighboring property, so you have a shorter flow path. So that was the idea there. So I'm going to go, and again, the hydrographs are included for everyone. But here was the results and analysis from that smaller one. So just assumed existing conditions, half acre, curve number of 85, so as is, and just put a time of concentration of 10 minutes. So 0.44 CFS, we've got volume runoff 0.282 acre feet. So when we switch it to that impervious, now we've got curve number of 98. We've got a significant increase here in the amount of runoff, not necessarily in the peak, but in the volume. And then just looking at 1 acre, I don't have a comparison of the existing conditions, but when you go up to 1 acre, you can see that peak flow rate almost doubles there. So that's kind of the results from that analysis. So I think what we were interested in was showing that it matters where you have your impervious area. Obviously, is it adjacent to something, is it not? But in situations where potentially you do have a long flow path, then maybe we should consider, those scenarios and allow for an analysis to potentially have some alternatives as opposed to going to a detention basin. I think this is why I included the release rate portion of our ordinance. It talks about the hydrologic disturbance. So in discussions with staff, essentially we had a hard time kind of common sense wise, if we were to require a detention basin off the edge of this, it's gonna have a slow release, yes, but technically it still hasn't left the property yet, right? It still has a long way to go. So this is kind of the idea of our solar farms. They have impervious areas and things like that trigger, but they're putting back a lot of native vegetation, and that's obviously affecting the hydraulics and hydrology. And so per the ordinance right now, there's no way to kind of capture that or think about runoff rate reduction outside of detention. It almost goes from, you're gonna trigger this, here's your allowable release rate, straight into detention facilities. So this data is just kind of, again, to open up discussion and think about potentially incorporating these ideas and maybe looking at the release rates at the final point exiting the site. Is it potentially getting the allowable release rate and maybe subtracting it from the peak existing condition, floating some of those ideas around, putting in a buffer area that'd be part of the stormwater management system instead of a detention basin. Those are the type of things that we're looking at. But I think part of the ag community was, just looking for kind of a blanket, if I have enough area, I should not be allowed detention. I think this shows that we can't just do that. There has to be an analysis as part of it. And I think maybe that's where we can have some exemptions for detentions, or as long as there's an engineer that shows this or wherever we want to go. So with that was kind of my spiel, and want to see kind of Al, go ahead, start it off.
Not having designed a retention basin for these solar facilities, and obviously everybody sees them everywhere. Is it all pretty much grass that's underneath, because it's all on piers, these things are situated on it? Are you considering impervious underneath the solar farms, or is it all returned to grass and things are deflected off of them as it rains? And
Yeah, so
how's that treated now?
So solar farms specifically, our thought process is to treat the panels themselves as impervious as long as they're indicating that they're gonna put vegetation underneath. From a detention perspective, from an overland runoff perspective, there could be concern that it's concentrating the flow through the aisles. So we're looking at specifically then the vegetation at that point where they put in the natives, we know those are gonna kind of grow and help with that. If they're gonna propose just regular grass, that might not hold as well and might cause some issues. And normally these are in areas where we haven't, the steepest one is over here on Charles. Haven't really seen any issues with that one.
There's a couple of large ones up in Harvard off of Route 14, north
Yes.
of town.
Yeah, there are those two. So that's been our methodology.
Just curious, that
Yeah.
design for those, how the county's treating that.
That's been our methodology. The panel area, if they're looking to do natives underneath, they can, we're not concerned about it. Obviously, it's one thing to establish it and be able to do that. But we ran into the first situation where unfortunately they have a long gravel access that needs to be, so they can't get it under the 12 feet wide because of fire approval, where they're going to be triggering detention, but they're also proposing almost 20 acres of native vegetation. So, from a conceptual perspective, for us, we also don't want to ask them to do a detention basin because these are technically gonna go back to being farmed. So if you put in a bunch of infrastructure, that makes it difficult. But at the same time, we know that, 25,000 square feet of impervious, you've got 22 acres of native vegetation. It'd almost be criminal to not, look at it from a perspective that your runoff rate should be reduced based on that ground type change. But the ordinance doesn't kind of let you capture that, right? So that was the concept between running some of these scenarios. And again, we did it real quick. Obviously, we can run a bunch of other scenarios based on discussions that come out if people want to see certain things. But it was just to kind of demonstrate this idea that I think we can maybe look at the tributary areas as a whole as opposed to focusing in on the disturbed area and, just saying you have to put a detention at the edge of that if it doesn't make sense.
A question, Stoyan, with the, for lack of a better word, I'll call it carte blanche, that the state gave the solar farms.
Yes.
Could you actually impose on them? Let's say you came and said, hey, I want a detention basin for whatever reason. Could you actually have any teeth and say?
I would, because at that point, I would indicate that it's part of their stormwater management facility. So that was gonna be the difference. So then we would enforce our performance standards and things like that we've developed. So, and with any of this, if they're gonna propose a buffer or whatever, instead of a detention basin, it now becomes that individual feature. And we're also moving towards, part of this conversation is tracking long-term maintenance now. And, that's gonna, first step was kind of looking at this and seeing if we could come up with something here to make it better, to have more flexibility when it comes to runoff rate reduction. And then with that, if we're gonna allow these other BMPs to help replace the detention basins, then we would like to track that, come up with methodologies for, maintenance, planning, things like that, where we would ask the applicant to submit a report to us annually, biannually, depending on the BMP and that whole process. And then if they don't, or, if they're not able to check mark simple things off, then we can issue a violation because now they're in violation of their stormwater management facility, which is part of the requirements in the SMO. It's already codified. If you're gonna change previously permitted stormwater management facility, well, they're not necessarily doing it willfully, but by lack of maintenance, that is changing it, obviously. So it's already got a lot of the kind of the puzzle pieces in place to put this together. So I just think that we can come up with something that allows us to do that instead of get your release rates, look at your disturbed area, and then you have to detain it.
So is the question like a flexibility issue?
Well,
I don't want to call it an exemption, but
No, I wouldn't say it's an exemption. I would almost put it as like an analysis, right, to demonstrate something. And what is it, that thing that they're demonstrating, and what are the requirements that we want to hold them to so that they can demonstrate that. So instead of hiring you potentially to design a detention basin, maybe they're hiring you to prove that they don't have to install a detention basin. So it doesn't necessarily, the ag community doesn't necessarily relieve the burden of I've got 80 acres, so therefore I can put as much, X impervious. So it's kind of, I think, meet somewhere in the middle where they still have to get an analysis done, but now they potentially don't have to sink extra money into, losing land for additional detention area or whatever it is, and potentially a buffer area might end up also taking less space than a detention area with just the amount of 0.15 reduction as opposed to maybe looking at the existing peaks. Would have an impact on their land. So I feel like it is giving them kind of what they're looking for, but based on this analysis, we can't just, to Ernest's point, blank statement say because you have this much area, you can just have X impervious. It needs to be looked at a case-by-case basis.
I'm kind of curious, on the smaller parcel that you have presented, did you move the square to the higher areas in the 80s, 90s just to see what that looks like as far as capacity and if it goes off of the property?
I did not.
I'm just saying, if I was a property owner, I would
Yeah,
definitely
so-
build in the upper right over the bottom left.
Absolutely.
This is a perspective.
It was just more to demonstrate of property that's near to the road. So obviously, if you move it back, you are increasing that flow path now, so that would become part of the analysis. So instead of a, 10-minute concentration here, which maybe that would be next to the roadway, maybe it's closer to a 5, but to keep consistency, the difference there, Dan, is you're gonna increase that time of concentration number. It's gonna, become higher, let's say, and so you're gonna see a little bit of a reduction. You're gonna have a higher tributary area, right? You're gonna have more land to work with. But that would be one of the incentives, right? Instead of putting your, improvements right next to the roadway, maybe you push them back, right, to help. And so then that way unfortunately, the county and every county and municipality has a bunch of existing detention basins that are, at this point, who knows how they're functioning. But I don't necessarily want to keep going with increasing detention basins. I would like to see more green infrastructure or, use of natives. The NRCS also has, this type of program already where they'll get into an agreement and they'll annually check on it to make sure that it's being maintained. So none of this is new, but in terms of how we look at runoff rate reduction, I think this would be something that we would be deviating off the normal path, which I certainly would like to challenge, considering, given, some of this data, if everybody is buying off on it, of course. So that's part of the question. Yes, Dan?
So, sorry I got in here late. Are we talking about solar farms or building on properties?
So, the activity started with just, here, I'll pull up the aerial for you. The activity started with just looking at a development. So basically, if this was an existing development, I put about a half acre of impervious. I don't know that it's that, I just wanted to get some numbers down. So let's say, now they want to expand and have another half acre, right? Normally that would trigger detention. So whether it's a solar farm, ag, residential subdivision, the same idea would apply. Is normally in the ordinance, you're just looking at this one box, and that one box is saying you need to release a certain amount of flow from that box. And then the problem is, though, once it releases, it has to go all the way through all this land, et cetera, before it even leaves the site. None of that really is being factored into the way that runoff rate reduction is factored into the way that the SMO is written. And none of the other ordinances really factor that in either. I get it, it's really simple and easy and conservative, and you can kind of hang your hat on that to kind of indicate that, potentially you're not gonna cause an issue. But I think also it's potentially over-restrictive from that perspective, and it eliminates you. The reason why I brought up the solar farms is because the one example is there's a solar farm kind of deeper into an ag property, and they needed a long access drive because of the fire department approvals. They couldn't get it under that 12.5 feet wide to get it exempt from the impervious. And so when you look at it, I forget what the number is, but about a half acre of impervious versus almost 20 acres of native vegetation, right? Like, that doesn't seem like, hey, let's have them do it on top of it. The ordinance doesn't really have an opportunity for us to take advantage of that. I mean, even to the point where, like, if we had something to say, for every acre or for every square foot of impervious, if you put a square foot of native vegetation, maybe that's an offset, right? So these are the type of ideas I wanted to kind of bring to the discussion today, have the engineers weigh in, see if they're gonna go along with it. They're probably gonna hate it, I don't know. and have an in-depth discussion on, you know, what some of the changes that maybe we want to make to the SMO related on this topic would be.
My comment on the solar farms, if I'm right, we're mandating that they go on and locate existing tile and keep them maintained. The other option would be if they have an area where they have water that's trapped, they could add more tile.
Yeah, we have that. I mean, for the solar farms, I think we feel pretty good about kind of all of those requirements. So, and, you know, one comment was made that the state, in terms of requiring the native vegetation point of view, is would we be able to enforce it? So the way that we're looking at it is that, yes, we would, because then it becomes part of your stormwater management system. You need that vegetation to offset this runoff. So we would then enforce our performance standards and all of those. And so in any case, if someone decides, okay, I'm gonna do these improvements, and then on the backside, I'm gonna add, you know, a native garden, a buffer strip of native, whatever it is, that area would become part of your stormwater management system. We would wanna track it long-term. And so with this too, Dan had the point, Dan Volkers, sorry, I got two of you Dans in today. You know, when this was a development that I brought up just to show if you're right next to the area where you're gonna release, your only option in this case is detention because you're so close. So Dan brought up the idea, well, what if you move it back? And, you know, that might be an incentive where if you move it back, now you might be able to do another type of design to where you can eliminate a large detention basin and meet those requirements. So that's kind of where we're at. Tyler, you had your hand raised. I want to make sure I get to you.
I would just, so conceptually, in the language, go back to language, you'd be adding a Roman numeral 4 under stormwater storage, and then some kind of language that states that if you can maintain the runoff rate across the existing contiguous properties, that, like, that's a condition?
So, yeah, something like that. And I don't know, it might just be a full rewrite.
Conceptually?
Depending on what we come up, what we come up with, not, in terms of like, still keep these release rates and things like that in terms of calculations, but maybe they're looked at from a perspective of what's your existing peak, post-peak, maybe that's how it factors in. It's part of it, yes.
Okay, so I have a similar line of question. You have the term stormwater storage waiver in here, and in another section, you have table 7, that is like a compensatory storage exemption. So that's kind of like a comp storage waiver concept. So what you're saying is you're thinking of building in a series of criteria that you would have a stormwater storage waiver, possibly, maybe adding a table like you have for the compensatory storage exemption, so that if you meet these criteria, then you don't need that?
I don't feel like it's a waiver though.
It's not necessarily a waiver, like you don't need to do it. It's just another method to meet the release rate requirements of slowing down the water. First, because that's what the release rate is focusing on slowing down that water downstream, right? A slower release.
So it's not a waiver. What's a waiver? Is that like a variance? Or what do you define as a waiver in your ordinance?
I don't know. What section are you reading the waiver?
It's not a defined term.
It's not a defined term.
So that's the problem.
Okay, well, maybe it is a waiver then.
Well, and like I said, this whole section, we can look at restructuring, rewriting. It doesn't necessarily need to function this way. I think what I'd like to figure out from the group is this a sound concept first and foremost, to have an additional analysis, consider the full tributary area, the flow path, time of concentration, or are there too many issues with it? I wanted to get far enough to give you guys something, but I didn't want to go too far to waste time if that's not really the appropriate direction that we should head in.
But I feel like Lake County has this.
We were talking about this with the Forest Preserve because of that issue. They said, well, what if, we've got 600 acres and we're developing a parking lot and then it flows through a wetland before it comes off site and, then it's negligible.
Absolutely.
Impact. And we were proposing that, and then the Forest Preserve just said, never mind, we'll put in detention, for our little parking lot.
But the example you're using is an offset, essentially. The one you're talking about with the solar farms.
Yeah, that one's, if
And
we
I-
wanted to do something like that in addition to it.
But basically what
throwing
you're
out an
saying
idea.
is that I'm gonna install this native vegetation, right? And technically you could make an argument that it's reducing the in-place curve number of what was originally there. And I hate to harken back to the days of Bob Gardner, but I could have swore he allowed for that. And I've done that a number of times. And that's a long time since I designed a detention basin, probably about as long as it's been for you as well. But he would essentially, you would be able to say, I'm gonna take this amount of area that is whatever it is now, at curve number of X, and it's gonna go into a documented easement
Yeah,
forever, right?
it does have that.
And then you credit that, and I don't know how it's codified. I don't know how it's,
It's in there.
but it's in the ordinance.
Yeah.
And essentially, that's kind of the case that I think you're making, right?
Well, I'd like to-
By putting in the easement, that doesn't enter the detention calculation.
Correct.
But that's assuming you're already providing detention for the site.
But you can put in enough that it would offset the requirement.
In theory. So,
Yes.
but it's the same
Right,
idea.
that is the idea, yeah. That is definitely the idea. And so obviously you can't just, or whatever, I'm putting a parking lot over here, so I'm just gonna put my natives over here that aren't hydraulically connected. Like, that wouldn't be the idea. It would be still within the same, flow path. It would have to be
Yeah.
downstream, obviously, to make it work. So those are the type of criteria and requirements that I think I would love to see that in the ordinance because I think it makes sense. To your point, if you've got 600 acres and you're doing a parking lot and it's going through wetlands and all this other stuff, is it really ever leaving the site and causing an issue downstream? And just to require a detention basin then just doesn't seem, it's very land intrusive and
Needs to be maintained too.
well, and all of these things need to be maintained, don't get me wrong. So I don't know where to go first. I got three hands.
I think that was the first one over, I think was.
Okay, I'll go Darren,
Go ahead.
Alan,
So my comment on Mike's example is that there's two things that had going for it, the parking lot in the middle of a 600-acre forest preserve. Number one is that it is a very small portion of a large property. And the second is that an analysis can be done that would be very clearly show that it was having no impact. I think the danger that we have to put some sort of guardrails on this, because otherwise we're gonna start having, 10-acre properties with a 5-acre parking lot being put on, and then, people trying to, nuance and slice and dice curve numbers and time of concentrations and all that to say, oh, no detention is required.
Absolutely. No, I agree with that. I just, I want to get to that step where we start thinking about that, but I didn't want to get there yet because I wasn't sure how the group would react to this concept first. So that's why I merely brought us to the point just to show you, some of the calculations, just some visuals of the different site and whatnot. So I agree with you there. Yes, we would have to dive deeper into that to avoid some of those situations.
Right, and even like the calculations that you showed, people could calculate the time of concentration a little bit differently, use a different storm event, and all of a sudden you're not showing, a 3% increase, you're showing a 30% increase in the runoff rate.
I agree, yeah. All right, I'll go to Tyler and Al, I don't know both of you.
So currently, either one of your two scenarios is located on a large piece of property. Neither is requiring detention. 5% rule. I'm double I, so I want to make that statement, and as we go say, well, we need to fix this scenario where the other one's near the road, it's near the outlet, it's concentrated flow, it's no buffering going on. So if we're looking at trying to amend the ordinance to fix that by providing a grass buffer between that half acre, 1 acre impervious area of a farmstead or whatever it might be, parking lot, putting grass back in below that area to get the composite runoff curb number back to where it was in the original state. And maybe detention's not required just by adding whether it's native grasses, whatever nature.
That's,
Is that kind of where we're heading, I'm guessing?
yes, that's the idea, and I will point out the 5% that if we do consider to keep the 5% easement, I do want to change it from calling it a conservation easement, because that's not
Correct.
normally what it is, right? So we'll figure that one out. I felt like that's probably a minor detail we can work on, but I do want to point out that you do have to demonstrate, again, because if you're on 100 acres, but you put that impervious right, next to a set of homes and it's draining into their backyards and that's where their septic system is, and obviously that would, yes, you would meet the 5%, but you wouldn't be able to demonstrate that, you're minimizing that flood damage and flood risk. Most of the time, yeah, you can kind of take a look and, we do that, but I have one just like that. It's the Fisher one, right? Where
Right.
he's got
That's
a
what
bunch
I
of
was thinking.
impervious next to the right of way. He put into detention, which is good because there's a culvert there, and obviously that's a low spot in the road that could really flood it out.
Or that could have been totally eliminated.
Well, but see, that's
Or reduced down, let's put it that way.
maybe reduced down, yeah. That would have been,
Mr.
the
Van
idea.
Berg is another example.
Yeah, so all of these can, again, we can start to take a look at it differently, and to Darren's point, like that's why I brought the allowable release rates, because we are gonna need to use them in some fashion to make sure that, we incorporate that somehow to eliminate that someone can kind of twist atomic concentration or curve number easily. Let me go to Ernest, and I'll go back to you if that's okay.
Okay, give him the
Or
first
okay,
shot
all right.
and let me talk. That's not very nice.
All right.
Well, as I went through this, when we received it yesterday, a couple of things dawned. And this discussion, in my mind, has gone kind of really solar-centric, if you will. But in looking at your one example with the larger tract,
Sure.
13 acres, whatever, a couple of things dawned on me. We ran into one farmer on Johnson Road only because we're working on the Johnson Road Bridge. And he was very upset when anyone identified as being county. And the reason was, a few years back, he wanted to put up a couple grain elevators. And he saw it as no big deal, okay? But he ended up having to put in detention because he made more surface and a larger impervious area. But this really upset him, I mean, to a great extent. And I've heard I heard a horror story out when the county fairground was trying to expand with another structure a few years back. They got into a whole myth over why do they have to do any of this, and that's fine. But as I was looking at this, if you looked at a farmer who wanted to put in additional grain elevators, and let's say it's gonna take up a half acre using your scenario, and you said to him, well, okay, you have an option. You could give up another half acre using your 1-for-1 square foot possible option and not have to do a detention, or you could do a detention. And as I was looking at all this, I'm like, would the system be better in a slightly different way? And this would apply to all, in my mind anyway. When we have an entity come in, we offer a pre-con. So before they start anything, they can come in and at least talk about where they want their entrance off of our road, how they're going to affect possible drainage with us. Now, not all of them take us up on it. Okay, a lot of them just go like a bull in a china shop and they lay out a whole design and they drop it on and say, it's perfect. And of course, we don't think it's perfect. That's fine. But I think your idea has merit. So let's say the farmer who comes in and says, okay, now I know. I want to do that. I either put a detention or I give up another half acre. As opposed to, again, bull in the china shop. I just want my permit, which is how they come in. So I think if you do it, there should be some kind of pre-con with yourself or your staff to say, hey, here are your options. Same too for the solar farm. So the solar farm, to Dan's point, yeah, they may want to shift 500 feet north, but I know they all tuck it to the road. And the only reason I know it is, we always get yelled at because it's a change in use. So our ordinance says, you give up the ultimate right of way per our ordinance, and they all balk and say, well, but we designed everything right down to the right of way. That's nice, kick it back, because you can't. And if you got a detention basin, go back another distance, because we have a requirement, how deep it is and all. So if there were a pre-con kind of thing, say, okay, fine, solar farm, you want to do this? You have two choices. Get more land from this farmer, go a little further up the hill, get a little more land from this farmer, or put in a detention basin. So just a thought as I was going through all of this, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would offer that right now if someone wanted to meet about their project before they even got started to understand the requirements.
I know you're available to, but I don't know that it's outlined anywhere.
No, it's
That
not.
someone looking at would go, and let's say someone comes to Al and says, okay, I want to put in this half-acre thing and they're being mean to me. Al could at least look at it and say, well, they offer a pre-con. Did you even go up to the counter and say hello, or did you just go in there wielding an axe? I mean,
To that point, what's happened on at least 5 occasions, somebody's putting a pole barn in.
exactly.
They get a permit from the building department because it's ag exempt. Next thing you know, 6 months later, oh, I'm putting toilets in here, or I've got a lot of gravel going on. Now we are talking to Stoyan, but they're not talked to in the beginning because it's ag exempt. They're not showing all their impervious, and
all it does is.
now we're kicked into something where, oh, if I'd known that.
Right. And all it does is, it really upsets the farm community. And it's not just that one guy that Al talked to, but now all of a sudden, they get a group together and they're pitchforks and torches ready to come at the planning and development department. So, I mean, I'm just saying, maybe we should at least be able to say, okay, look, wait a second. There was an option. You didn't take the option. Now you're asking for forgiveness instead of permission. So at least that too would get back to the community like, oh, I'm gonna build a 20,000 square foot pole barn. Hey, wait, before you do that, Charlie got in trouble. Go over and talk to him first. It would take time, but I'm just saying, I think we should have a path outlined so that at least you'd have someone to point at and go, wait a minute, before you bring the pitchforks and the torches, you could have come in. You chose not to, okay?
No, that's fine. I don't know who reads the ordinance, we can put it in there.
You'd be surprised. A lot of them do. A lot of them do. I'm sorry, a lot of them do.
We can have it in there. No, that's, like, all of these things, like I said, before I get off track, and I'd like to maybe get input from Brad, Lori, and Spring, the idea of the offset of I was just throwing out a number, and so I don't know if it's a square foot of one or square foot of the other. I don't know if we have anything that points to, if we'd be able to do something like that, that's really clean, that gives you that in the chart. I don't know, but that's where I refer to you guys. You've done a lot of green infrastructure in Algonquin, you're probably seeing those offsets, but I don't know if it's neatly captured to where we can point to something and have confidence in it, or can be.
Yeah, it's not a one-to-one, it's not, it depends so much on the site. I wouldn't be confident saying, here's a ratio, we can apply this everywhere, because it depends on the slope, it depends on the underlying soils. If you're putting, it also depends on the seed mix too. So all those kind of play into it. So, I think conceptually I like the idea of allowing that trade-off, but I think it's gonna have to be on like an, site-by-site basis, rather than just a simple, I don't know of anything, and, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know of any like chart or research that would be easy to then just stick in the ordinance and say this applies throughout the county.
I agree, and also just thinking about the timing of establishment, it's gonna take at least 3 to 5 years to really get that risk system established. So I don't know what kind of time scale we're talking about for some of these projects. If people have the time and they're that proactive, then it might work. In other instances, maybe not.
It takes management of those.
And that's what my
especially
other
on the
follow-up question
homeowner.
was, what are the performance standards then?
Well, I think that's where we'd have to figure out what those are, and, we're not gonna drive an applicant to that, but if they wanted to choose that option, then it's available to them, and they would know going into it,
Yeah.
what some of the
I love it.
requirements
I'm all
are.
in favor of more
As
native
I'm sure
vegetation.
You have, MCCD has plenty of sites where you're looking to expand a parking lot on a big site that, then I have to say, oh, you have to do detention. And to Michael's point, same idea, right? So, so there's not, it just isn't necessarily just benefiting ag communities, it's benefiting, other, Tyler.
So, some things that, just thoughts.
Sure.
The conservation easement, I mean, you noted that it's not conservation easement, and I think that's something
Yeah.
that we should address if we're gonna rework this section. But then on your 13-acre parcels, you've got the tributary area, right? And does that assume that it's staying as a row cropped farm field? And then we've been talking about, these native grasses and so are we expecting that we're gonna take part of that and have to offset it instead of intention with different plantings? Or is this agricultural use enough infiltration over the area out of the site? You know what I mean? I think those are things that you need to think about. And so if you're gonna go, hey, you gotta offset it with grass, well, in that ag community, do we just let it go and whatever? Or can they make hay on it once a year, or, graze it? These kind of thoughts, things I'm thinking about.
I was thinking about the same thing, and I didn't go too deep, like I said, because I was nervous about putting too much energy and getting too far ahead of myself.
Same theory needs to go to your solar farms with, what you guys call native grasses, I call unusable. A lot of people talking about putting sheep or cattle in these solar farms too, to utilize that grass that's growing.
We do have a couple of submittals, so, and those are gonna go underneath the panel, so for again, solar farm specific, I'm not looking to just generally talk about solar farms, but that would be within the panel area where normally the farmer wouldn't be farming anyway, so it's not necessarily requiring additional space. But yeah, I think you have to consider the ground type and all of these things. And so to me, it sounds like we should start thinking about that. So I think that's gonna be the next step. And I wanna start jotting this down. But like I said, I just wanna get all the feedback in first, get the buy-in from everyone, and see where we're at. Jody, yes?
So I'm just thinking about this from a regulatory enforcement, trying to monitor this in the future. So to their point, like if they have an area that's supposed to be native grasses, how would I, as a regulatory agency, unless I'm going out and visiting the site, know that they're actually keeping it as native grasses? At least with a pond, at least with a detention basin, I have a hole and a restrictor and it's there, right? It's providing that, release rate. Whereas if we start having these patches of native everywhere, and then people might change the definition of what's native, what's not. Spring mentioned performance standards, so I guess I'm just trying to think how we would monitor this in the future. Is it easements? And then I don't think the farming community wants easements on, because no matter what, either detention or a BMP, they're still giving up ag land, right? So I just see if we have these natural areas, them getting plowed over a lot quicker without anybody noticing, or any sort of enforcement.
So I think, yeah, we'll have to establish some guidelines, and that goes for my staff too, of what are we looking at? What we're looking to incorporate is a self-reporting process and tracking, basically, this is gonna be part of your stormwater management system. So if you plow it over, then that's gonna be a pretty decent indicator that you can move forward with a violation, like, hey, you've changed your stormwater management system. And to that point, if it's a detention basin or an area, it's still an area that they're gonna have to figure out what they're gonna wanna do with. I think the difference though is that potentially you can reduce that footprint with some of these other options as opposed to a detention basin. Because the detention basin, you have to really look at the grading of the site, and if it doesn't work out, now you're making additional manipulations to get the water from point A to point B instead of just using, the natural flow path and kind of working with that environment. And so it becomes part of the stormwater management system. There's a maintenance plan that's developed that they have to hold to, and then they would, that's where we would say, okay, is it providing some pictures? What are the guidelines? I think that's where we're gonna also need to be mindful that this is something that someone who's, doesn't have a lot of experience, if they choose to go down this route, that they would be able to execute their daily operations. And certainly there's, the Land Conservancy, and there's a lot of programs nowadays where you can go get help with these issues. It's not like people are, you gotta go and figure it out type of thing. There are a lot more resources, I will say to that. So I don't necessarily want to shy away. I do see your point though, for a certified community, how they're gonna feel about now having to track that. And again, I think what we can do in that instance is potentially write the ordinance to where if the municipality doesn't want to allow that and they want the detention basin, then maybe that's their choice. As a way to kind of appease that if they feel like they don't have the staff or whatever it is. I just don't, that would be a potential challenge to them. And if they did want to do it and they don't have the staff, then is that something that us at the county would have to pick up? I'm not sure, but these are the type of ideas that, I do want to have an in-depth conversation and see if we can incorporate some of this, make some changes that I think are going to be beneficial and make sense. Again, promote development where you're not just cramming your impervious somewhere. Now you're putting more thought of, okay, I can get some benefits by pulling this back or doing it this way. And I think that's really where we're trying to go with this.
And I guess one more to kind of build on what Darren had talked about before, just, the simple calculations. I'm thinking about what would I physically require from an engineer as they're submitting this and trying to prove it. In Lake County, we always talk about adequate downstream capacity, and usually that means a critical duration analysis at the point of discharge. So I guess I don't think this is gonna be easier engineering-wise. I think this might actually get a little bit more in-depth and more complicated than just picking the detention off of the chart.
Well, you're not gonna be picking detention off a chart, definitely. Darren?
So I was gonna, building on some of these conversations, it seemed like the 5%, like the agricultural conservation easement, I don't have much experience with that, but it seems like that's like not very popular.
Well, it didn't work the way it was supposed to.
I don't have the history behind it, but the idea is that you, as you have a larger piece, you're gonna have scattered impervious areas around your site. And so trying to capture all of those different areas because you're triggering detention in a way gets around that issue, and also it's a way to allow additional impervious because you have more space. That's kind of how I look at it in terms of what it's trying to do, is allow more impervious because you have more acreage, and then also kind of accommodate this issue of just random, pole barn over here because the farmer needs it over there, and then a setup over here and something else, down at another location type.
Are you always capped, you're capped at a max of 5%?
Yeah, as an option.
It seems like if we were to, and I'm maybe skipping towards like an end, but what would happen if we just eliminated part 2 and we, rather than putting the 1 acre limit on part 1 with the 10%, if you didn't cap the 10%, right? You could say you could do, like DuPage County doesn't have a cap on their 10%. So you forget the 5%, forget the conservation easement, and you say, you could go up to 10% of your land with impervious area, but the key would be, like per Jody's point, the applicant would have to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the enforcement officer that there's adequate downstream capacity. And part of that might be, as Brian had said and Brad had talked about, putting in native vegetation, right? Because then you're you're adding to, you're decreasing the curve number. So that would help you achieve adequate downstream capacity. I don't know, that's just a thought I had.
I'm like I said, I'm okay to rewrite this in a way that makes sense. I think if you use the 10%, then you potentially eliminate like some of those like 5-10 acre scenarios where you can't drive with that impervious, right, to kind of get around that. So yeah, I think we have to be mindful of incorporating that and how that's going to look on smaller sites too, because sometimes those are the most, generate the most concern. So, I don't know, like, part of our brainstorm session was to still use release rates, but instead of saying you're gonna release it from your disturbed box, maybe you subtract it from your existing peak. To Jody's point, you're now analyzing, peak conditions, and so you're, taking advantage of that. So it's still the same idea of you have this allowable release, but you're not over restricting it and using it in situations like this, or to Michael's point with the big forest preserve, where it doesn't make any sense to do it. It's not providing benefit potentially.
And prior to the 2005 ordinance, we were doing things like that on areas where small impervious areas are leaving even a subdivision development. I can think of a couple over in Johnsburg, Lakemore area, that the lots came in, they were designed for, the runoff curve number was no more than it was prior, because Lakemore's kind of Fallon County, but they had their own, it wasn't Fallon County yet. But we were showing that the runoff curve number wasn't increasing, it was less, and then as the builder tried to build a house on it, he ran into the new county rules and got stuck with a lot that he couldn't build on. Because it turned into a floodplain, whatever, it just got really complicated. You might know which one I'm talking about, I won't mention names, but it was, that's how things were done back in the late 90s.
You can play Jeopardy.
That's how we did things in the 90s before the county started the new ordinance with the new release rates on small areas that trickled off. And just showed that the runoff curve number was significantly less. It wasn't a huge amount of impervious area, 2-3 homes and maybe a little bit of street. But it wasn't everywhere in the county. That was what the county was kind of doing at the time.
Well, maybe we're going back to the good old days
Well,
then.
I'm here like which I think is a good thing.
Move section 5 into ordinance.
Is that a motion? Are you waiting for a second? Is that what you're trying?
I did, when we were going through this, we didn't have like a set goal, like let's just try to match existing. That's something that we can look at, and I also, when I look back at some of the older subdivision designs, they're using curve numbers of like like 65, 66, 67, 68. I don't know that maybe if we're gonna rewrite this, maybe we have some specific curve numbers where you can't go below that if you're using a certain type of, ground cover to kind of give ourselves that cushion, so that you can't kind of manipulate it to the point. So it has some conservative nature built into that, or some safety factor built into that. And
because if we're matching existing, you're gonna need a lot less detention. I mean, that was an option, to try to use natives to match existing or detention to match existing. The reason that the pond's so big is because the release rate's so small.
right. What I was thinking of, this was one idea, was you take your disturbed area, so that's still codified, you figure out your release rate, and maybe you subtract that off of the peak. So now you're reducing the peak, and so for the areas where you're up against, the right of way, how you won't be able to reduce your peak without detention. So that kind of eliminates the situation potentially of, and drives the incentive. Okay, well, let me move back. Let me try to gradually ease the slope. to try to get that reduction by the disturbed area, that could be one idea. But I do understand that your allowable release rates are, compared to your existing peaks, is I don't know, 90% reduction, whatever that is, in that area.
Yeah.
So and like I said initially, a 90% reduction would normally seem good, because then you have a lot of confidence that potentially you're going to be alleviating a lot of downstream stormwater issues, which I don't know that that's the case necessarily, because you still have higher frequency storms, you have higher rain events.
Yeah, because I don't think you're gonna get to the point you wanna be at with natives in trying to maintain your release rate if you keep the same release rates. You can't reduce the curve number enough to get
Right.
there.
I understand that, yeah, but
And that's kind of what Al was talking about, is they're just modifying curve numbers of the proposed developments to match existing, basically.
yeah, I think we should strive for some kind of reduction in flow rates. I just don't know that, because in terms of, looking at the model here, the one with the long, flow path, this is what the numbers show,
Yeah,
It's-
like
there's-
Sharon said, I think you can just modify those things to get whatever you want. That's what you're gonna have people doing. Everybody's just gonna come in and they're gonna know what result they want, and they're gonna give you numbers, and what are you gonna, you can only nitpick things so much as a reviewer, before you have to just acquiesce to the other person that's a PE saying this is the way it is. They're signing and sealing it, so,
I agree, Steve and I, all of us can get in a room and do a longest flow path for the time of concentration, and we would all get a different answer. And so that's, I think, what we'd end up seeing if we're talking about, meeting the existing release rate. We'd all become experts in reviewing time of concentration flow paths.
But wouldn't that happen anyway when you're doing detention design though?
No?
because it's kind of, you're locked in by the release rate, it's what it is.
Well, I'm saying there's still a release rate here, but you're still for your critical durations, you're still doing time of concentration for sizing and other components. So you would still, I feel like, run into that issue where you have varying times of concentrations.
It really doesn't have any bearing on
It doesn't have an effect on the size of the detention basin.
Yeah, because the release rate's so small, so you can make it whatever it is, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so if we were to try to use that and factor that in, you guys are saying that, but no, because then you run the model and you use the time of concentration to affect it. But isn't that fair though? If you did that, isn't that?
Cookbook chemistry. Did you ever take a chemistry class? You had to come up with an answer and they back it off.
But if it's reflective of the design, if you're going at a 5% slope and you reduce it to 2% and you're adding now, you're incorporating different design measures, it's reflective of the design. It's not like you're cooking it. I think the thing is though, you'd have to be able to effectively match the time of concentration and the curve numbers with what the proposed design is.
I think you could still cook it, I'm sorry. I think, and I'm not saying anybody should, I'm not saying anybody does, but I think it's a possibility, and it could easily occur.
Could you do this volumetrically rather than via flow rate, is maybe the way you want to approach this?
Like I said, I'm open.
To avoid that discussion point.
You tell me.
What are you suggesting? Volumetric?
Well, if you size the restrictor the same way, you have less volume, you need a lesser flow rate.
The other difficulty as you do your restrictors for flow rates, some of these properties are so small, your restrictors are so tiny, we can't even get the storm to drain out within 72 hours.
Well, I mean, you could go the
Why not
minimum,
increase it?
there's a whole different, we're going down a very, very deep path here, because now you're getting, there's minimum restrictor sizes too, that some people use, but I'm just saying, if the goal here is to have a controlled flow rate, which is one way of going about this, maybe we need to consider it as a volumetrically rather than via flow rate. And I don't have that answer for you right now, but
Well, like I said, this was meant to drive discussion, because I want to figure out the pitfalls, and I know going into it, yeah, someone can just punch a bunch of stuff into some kind of analysis and software, and that goes regardless with any type of requirements in design. You know, I don't think we escape that. That's why we do the review and double check everything. So I feel like I guess it would be back on the reviewers to make sure that, you know, they're catching those things. If it's too complicated, then yeah, things are gonna get missed. But if we rein it in and have some specific requirements, or, you know, we can avoid some of that, then we can get around that issue.
It seems like going with DuPage County, like Darren was saying, with the 10%, that kind of gets at what you want with these things, because you're putting, you know, you're letting the EO look at it with determining if the, you know, whatever's downstream is going to be susceptible to flooding. And whether or not they're, you know, going to be allowed to have that waiver of detention, because if you're requiring detention, that's where you're going to need property, and if you're trying to get the release rate down to the same as a detention release rate, I don't think you can do it with native plants.
Yeah, no, I know you can. I'm challenging, I guess, I want to challenge the idea that we need to get it to as low as those release rates. Like, do we need to do that?
Well, then why would we, but then are you requiring detention basins?
You still would, so there would, like I said, I think that there should be some kind of reduction of the flow. I think that would be part of that. That's part of the, you know, runoff rate requirement. So if you have the situation where you're right next to the roadway, you know, you're gonna want to reduce that flow rate because of that capacity of that swale or that culvert. I don't know if there's a culvert there, potentially there's a culvert there, right? And, you know, whether it's the 10%, basically asking an engineer to analyze it the same way that, you know, they would, because the 10%, let's just go to the 10%, because in the 10%, it's saying you don't need detention. I don't necessarily.
But you have to analyze it, right? It
Well,
doesn't say
you
you
have
don't
to-
need detention. It says you have to, if you analyze it and show there's adequate downstream capacity and there's no impacts, then you wouldn't need detention.
Correct, right, with as long as you have the 10% number. But if you have more than that and you can still prove that, then like in Michael's case with the forest preserve property.
But in that case, he was talking about a 600-acre property, then they'd be putting in 60 acres parking lot.
Well, I'm
But
just,
isn't that over the entire property?
But-
So, I mean, if they had parking lots and buildings and huts and I mean, I could see where on a 600-acre site where you'd end up with 60 acres of stuff total.
or just, you know, an 80-acre
trims.
parcel or whatever,
Yeah.
10, I don't know. Large enough property, maybe 600's too big for this.
That's what he started out with.
Yeah, so it's the only one, nobody else threw out examples except these other two.
Point, you get on these 10-acre parcels and if you end up with an acre and a half, right, you're over your 10%.
You're over your 10%, so then we're saying you need a detention basin. So you're going back to a detention basin design as opposed to another type of design that might achieve the same effect. Is all I'm trying to look at, is to kind of get out of this bubble and.
But is the effect then to maintain the existing release rates off the site?
Well, so, again, moving forward, you know, if we want to say you have to maintain the existing release rates, then that would be the criteria. If we want a certain reduction of that release rate, then that would be the criteria. I don't know what that criteria is necessarily, or if we can come up with something that makes sense. And again, I can go back and run, you know, some more numbers and see what that looks like. I feel like some of you guys probably don't need that, but obviously it'd be good to just see what the results show regardless. To then say, yeah, is it you run your existing peak flow rate prior to, I mean, that's one of the options here in the allowable release rates is just the way that the ordinance is written. I don't even know why it's an option. I'm just gonna read it real quick. Release rates for a detention facility shall not exceed the lesser of the following. So you don't even have an opportunity. You're triggering the runoff rates, right? And then it goes into allowable release rates, and then it just specifically goes straight into detention facility. Like you have no other option.
Well, that's what I was gonna ask, Sawyer, with the other counties. Wasn't this mimicked off Lake County?
Yeah, they all kind of read
too
that.
restrictive for some of these smaller tract lands to where we adjust it for, this is still good, maybe for the big subdivisions, but it's really restrictive. It's forcing detentions to be large on whether it's a 10-acre, 5-acre, 20-acre.
Right.
You're trying
So-
to fix it this whole.
Right.
Yeah, and the way that it's written too is it says shall not exceed the lesser of the following. So you have option one, which is our standard 0.04, 0.15 release rates.
Right.
There's the comment of the existing conditions peak. I don't know of any scenario where this isn't gonna be the lesser. So like to me, why even put in 2 and 3?
Right.
That's what I'm saying. So I feel like we can use these release rates, but then somehow factor in or not and say you need a certain reduction off of your existing conditions peak.
This has to be adjusted, I believe, with the area that we're gonna try and come up with here. Both have to happen almost simultaneously.
And I think, Stoyan, to answer like for number 3, I think that's in there in cases where like a site would have a really small release rate for.
Yeah, this, yeah, so yeah, that's-
Storage.
Yeah.
It has a lot of compressional storage, so there's hardly any release coming off it.
yeah.
Number 2 is for like a known flood hazard basin. So if you've got, you know, floodway going through the middle of a town and the natural 100-year rate there is 0.09, then the community, you know, or the county could adopt a 0.09 100-year release for that
area.
watershed area.
Yeah, I just don't know of any that exist. Obviously, yeah, you could come up with some, but in terms of the relationship between 1 and 3, the existing conditions peak runoff rate, yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can come up with a theoretical site, but in most conditions, this is gonna be what drives it. And I just, again, it just feels like you're going from talking about, okay, how do we deal with runoff rates to straight to detention facility? And there's no other options given, and I just feel like there should be other options. And if we can find a way to incorporate those, I think that's probably the best way to make this better and to encourage people to find other ways of designing their sites instead of just your straightforward detention basin. And because this is very restrictive, your detention basins are going to become quite large and you are losing a lot of property than potentially if we do want to modify this. And I don't know if
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, the trickiest part, as we all know, as you engineers or designers, when you get to these really small restrictors, everybody's got a different idea of how to make something work and not clog when it's less than 4 inches, 3 inches.
Yeah.
It turns into a maintenance nightmare, and how can we clean that up to where, okay, so I'll come up with a typical detail, it does work, and maybe it's not possible, but that's the biggest problem, is that we use these low rates, we're designing these restrictors. We used to say, make the basin big enough for that volume, for the 0.05, but in the 0.14, anyway. And we would use a 3 or 4 inch restrictor and say, we're not going any smaller. We don't care if you put it in a wall, we don't care if you put it in the floor net section, but we've gone past that point, which is making a lot of wetland bottom basins should be dry.
Well, and that's the other thing with detention basins, how many of those have we seen that don't? They're just a muddy mess and the design and everything, it, you know, so that's another point. Ernest, you've had your hand up for a while. Let's go to you.
I missed my chance to comment because I thought of it a couple seconds later, so just, as we consider it, three things. I don't know that self-monitoring is a good idea at all. I'm sorry, because.
Well, it's just self-reporting, not.
Okay,
you know.
self-reporting, because, I mean, as an example, I got into a CRP program for trees 28 years ago. In the first 10 years, everybody was good about all of it because you got a payment for part of what you put in. The next 10, they said, well, the state can't afford, but you should still do it. They came out at the 10-year and the 20-year mark, and I was part of it. And they got to mine, and the guy said, oh, you're actually maintaining yours. And I said, yeah, why not? Oh, when we stopped paying, everybody just kept sending in their little postcards saying, yeah, I'm doing it. And they cleared the trees and turned it back into cropland. So self-monitoring is one. Two, as you look at the potential for a native planting, you gotta be real careful on two levels. And we're experiencing with the DOT. We have a test plot out at the DOT, which is it's a pollinator planting. And we're doing one with a grant we got from ComEd over at Raycow, Randall, Ackman, McHenry down there. And I don't want to tell you how many people have called us, when the hell are you going to mow those weeds? What the hell's wrong with you people? And so people have to realize what they're going to get if they do it right is that, and the one at the DOT is now in its 5th year, so it's finally considered established there, fine. The one at out by Raycow and Randall and Ackman and McHenry Avenue, that thing's only in its 3rd year, and we're doing that under Hay and Associates, guiding our people so they can learn how to manage, how to maintain. And in its own way, it's a logistic nightmare. And I'm just trying to envision a sole person doing it on their own and doing it right.
You almost need a
Lots of
management-
work.
You almost need
I
a
don't-
management document ahead of time going, this is what this entails if you go down this path.
But they still, I'm saying, they still won't do it. The logistics will
Which is
kill them, and they'll
fine.
just.
I'm not saying that's what they have to do, Ernest. I'm just saying there's some alternatives to detention. And if
I
the
agree.
person
I'm just
prefers,
saying-
I don't want to deal with all of that, then sure, do your standard detention basin like you want, and, you know.
All I'm saying is,
So-
if we had somewhere to send them to say, okay, look, this is what it's going to have to look like, because as I said, our areas, so many people say it's weeds.
Well, that's
And-
where I was going, was because I don't want that on my property.
There you
I'd rather
go.
have a hayfield that I could mow and
Yeah.
get use out of.
And so I'm just saying, expect that as we're working on this. And one other thing, when the comment was made, well, let's maintain release rates, you're kind of reiterating the state drainage law, which is you can't let any more, faster, anything else go off your property before or after you do anything to it. So you can say it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with restating, but it's already in the state drainage law. So these were just comments to keep in mind as we look at reworking. That's all they were.
Well, I think that, you know, to make this work, you would have to have some kind of existing conditions peak runoff rate reduction. And, you know, we would be looking for some kind of reduction. Is it to the point where you're having a 90% reduction? You know, I don't know some of that. Those are the type of questions and looking at this and trying to revisit it and analyze. At the end of the day and everything that we do, and maybe it's another meeting, and, you know, before we go out, jot some of the ideas down and look further and whatnot, and talk to some people, et cetera. And, you know, hopefully that'll give me enough time to, by April 8th, I don't know. You know, we can do all of that. And if the answer that we come back with is we're stuck with this, or maybe we make a couple of modifications, then maybe that's the end result, guys. You know, I'm not, again, I just want to challenge the idea to see if we can come up with something to incorporate this, because everyone here has agreed, at least on merits, that, you know, I saw a lot of yeses, and then as we get into the details, yes, we're starting to struggle, but obviously this is the first that I've ever been a part of to at least look at it a little bit differently than just your standard, here's my box in this huge area, now I'm gonna put a detention basin here and release, it's still not off my property. Just that conceptually to me, I have a hard time with, accepting that you need to put a detention basin at the edge of that development in order to make sure you're not, you're minimizing flood risks. I get that it's a very conservative idea that everyone can get behind, but in certain situations, you're just gonna have someone with common sense say, why am I putting this detention basin here?
And I guess going back to the impetus of the whole thing was when you went to get a sanitary discharge permit in the 90s, you needed to go through NIPSI to get your wastewater treatment plant approved. And NIPSI required that you adopt their NIPSI model ordinances, which were a 0.15 CFS per acre. So just kind of by default, municipalities prior to county ordinances coming in were being forced into adopting these ordinances just to get discharge permits for their wastewater treatment plants. So when ultimately the county ordinance came in, it wasn't a change because we already had the NIPSI model ordinances in place. So there wasn't a lot of municipal pushback, I think, at that time. But that's kind of the reasoning or how this all developed was through NIPSI. Outside of Northeast Illinois, they don't have these requirements. So.
That makes a lot of sense, I guess.
Thank
you for that.
No,
I didn't, I never would have connected those dots or so. But so, to that point then, I feel like since this was something that was born out of, another place and just kind of carried over, do we want to take a closer look at it?
So MWD has looked at their release rates, and they have different release rates for different watersheds. I think Al was saying different release rates for different size developments potentially, right? If you had like a smaller development, you could have a larger release rate.
But I guess I still would just challenge the idea of how you apply that release rate, right? Because you're doing it in the disturbed area. And again, if you're on a larger site and you do have a longer flow path, I know you guys are gonna say these are just numbers on paper, but at least from this perspective, I was trying to be truthful and actually coming up with the slope and modeling the numbers. And when you have a longer time of concentration, you don't really see a change is what I'm getting at. And so that's why I just figured maybe we can relook at some of this and figure out a way to do it differently.
And it was kind of also, they were putting in, it's in place to try to alleviate flooding that was occurring in the 80s in a lot of places closer to Chicago. So that's where they came up with the reduction with new developments and redevelopments, just to reduce that flooding impact. The streams were flashy, there's a lot more flooding, so they kicked it way down. That in MWRD is like typically about 0.3 CFS, so almost double this is what they're allowing, but there's still reduction required. But there's it's a whole lot of redevelopment there in the city, because it's already paved.
Yeah, they came up with those release rates based on analysis of Salt Creek. That was their study sample. So definitely out here where it's more rural, you could consider opening that up,
But I still think the question though,
I guess I look at it from the other way. We're talking about developed areas that had problems, then they had to, take the release rate way down. Like, aren't we being proactive by having a more restrictive release rate so we don't have those problems in the future? Like, the Fox already floods, right? We already have issues with it being flashy and the dams and things like that. So I guess I'm just looking at it from the other side. Like, don't we want to keep flooding from happening and be thoughtful for the future.
Yeah, well, right, so, but I guess what does that look like though? Does that look like this and you're just doing a detention basin, or are there alternatives to that philosophy? I feel like there's alternatives. I think there's been many situations, especially in Algonquin, where they've gone in and done green infrastructure, and that has reduced flow rates, that has reduced floodwater, right, Brad? The one we did the talking tour, there was an area, you guys redid that whole area, and the option was upsize the culverts in the road because it was overtopping, or do the green infrastructure. They went with the green infrastructure, and now the road doesn't overtop, right? So that's a flooding component. So we know that it works, we just don't necessarily have a study where we can package it nicely.
You need a study.
Thank you, Brian. Well, and
all this.
Well, I will say with our plans of doing, watershed planning, we are gonna look at watersheds and release rates and future analysis and trying to track that so that if we do need to reduce release rates in certain areas, we will do that. So to your point, I'm not saying this is blanketed. This is the caveat of information is provided. Everything is looked at on a situation per situation basis. If you're developing in an area where you know that there's flood risks that exist, then I would almost even want to rewrite the ordinance to open it up to allow you to be more restrictive because of that downstream capacity element. And so you're not losing that, but you are gaining it by giving people more option in areas where it's not developed yet, there's more land, giving them more alternatives, those type of things. Yes.
So just when listening to you, it sounds like we have two flow rates. We have a flow rate off of the non-pervious, and then the second is more of a theoretical flow rate off of this site, right? So
Refer to the two numbers.
Yeah,
right?
so, okay.
1.5?
So
Yeah,
the
those are two different rainfall events.
No, I'm saying, I guess
Yeah,
what
there
we're
would-
talking about. So it sounds like you're looking for more of a, based on your site, if you can maintain and control the flow rate off the entirety of the site, like the 13-acre site. But then we're talking flow rates, and it seems like the flow rates are all off the impervious, right?
Well, they're both. So I think in this idea, okay, and I understand that you can manipulate it, but ultimately, let's just pretend that we run with this idea, right? Let's just do it. So what we would expect to see is a tributary area from your development area. So you're not including, so the reason I highlighted 13 acres here, this whole property is 77, but those other areas are not tributary to what's happening here. So I think that would be the first part, is you delineate a tributary area. I don't know, yeah, you can have some subtle differences there, but it's all based on grading, and so I feel like that's gonna be more or less consistent. You're not gonna have a real opportunity to manipulate that as much. So then the second thing you would do is analyze the flow path through there. So now that you're in your tributary area, you just go from point A to point B, your longest flow path. I feel like, again, I don't know how much differences there are gonna be in that, to the point where, and I'm talking about tolerances of maybe like 10%, things that you can live with. So you define that flow path, and then you figure out how fast is it going from point A to point B. So it's a length and velocity thing, and you're considering, if I'm a paved surface, I'm gonna be running off faster. And there's a chart you use for that. So if you're not a paved surface, you're gonna be running off slower, and there's this chart there. You plug that in, and then you get a time of concentration. So, I understand that someone can manipulate that, but I feel like you can only go so far, because at the end of the day, you have to present this information, and if it's totally BS, the reviewer's gonna be like, hey, this doesn't work.
So at the end of the day, though, when it leaves the 77, whether it's got what's on there or another half acre, when it leaves the 77, it would be different.
that was the point of running this scenario here between the existing conditions, and then I added a half acre, and you can see how I changed those numbers, Tyler. So the 98 is your impervious, the 85 would be your, row crop area. So
that figures
So,
at the, I can call it the outlet, at the ultimate outlet.
yeah, which in this case, it basically is the end of this here. So it's still not leaving the site necessarily, but I wanted to just simplify it. So for lack of, when it leaves this point here, in those two conditions, where am I? Your peak flow rate is virtually the same, your water is virtually the same. And that's because you haven't impacted enough of the site to see a difference in that, which is, I think, is what you're getting at.
Yeah, right, I get, yeah.
So, and this is just to demonstrate that I think that you should be looking at it from that perspective. I think there should be some kind of reduction factored into that a little bit, to Jody's point, where we do want to try to at least make it better and plan for the future. But I don't know that it's the 0.15 CFS per acre makes sense, because that is a huge reduction, when the data doesn't really support that. But that's where we can add information to indicate, like, if you're developing in a more urban area or whatever, leave those options open. The downstream capacity element is part of that, right? So it's not just lowering the existing peak by a certain amount, it's also the downstream, it's also, whatever else. Are you in a floodplain area? That's where you can have those kind of check boxes that the engineer would perform and demonstrate, I guess. Yes, Brian?
So going back a couple steps ago and kind of to summarize my thoughts, I think, this idea, in my opinion, has merit to allow, take that broader view and allow some more options for maintaining flow off these sites. As it compares to what we do in Algonquin, it's kind of comparing apples to oranges. Main reason is a lot of the green infrastructure we put in has not been directly tied to development. It's more reconnecting inside stream channels to their floodplain. And that's where we've seen a huge reduction in flooding, is just, being able to recreate those floodplain benches that didn't exist because of erosion before. The other big point that I want to make is our experience in Algonquin is we've had a huge challenge of having privately owned areas maintain native vegetation. So that's why I have 1,000 acres that the village owns, because the way we've gone is, okay, developer, this is the way we want you to do this, but you're also going to subdivide this parcel and you're going to donate it to the village once it's been established to our criteria and it meets our performance specifications. And we have a funding mechanism in place that allows the village to maintain those areas into perpetuity, as opposed to relying on another entity or a private, individual to maintain that. So that's, like I said, it's kind of apples to oranges, and not to say that we can't write the ordinance in such a way that this is a viable option. But to a lot of people's points, Jody and Darren, there has to be some really strong guide rails to make sure that these areas are maintained, that they're designed well, that they're not just, hey, we've hit this criteria, we now hit this box, and, we've rechanged the use, we've cut down all those trees, we've plowed over the native vegetation and just kind of carried on our way. The way that we've done that in Algonquin is by taking ownership of those parcels and doing the maintenance ourselves, which isn't something that's probably feasible on a county-wide basis to do anything like that.
Yeah, that definitely would be a challenge. I think, just circling back to your point though, in those areas where you've gotten that degradation, that curve number then is going up because you no longer have that. So I think you're demonstrating that you lower your curve number, you get that benefit.
Yeah.
And it's not like an artificial lowering at that point.
No, it's a real
thing, right? Yeah.
But the challenge is, having the plan in place, having the funding mechanisms and the maintenance,
I
in
don't,
place to maintain it.
and this isn't something that I want to drive. If someone wants to go through that effort, then yeah, I think there's going to be those things in place and they're going to be aware of it, that they need to take a look at it. And I think we can potentially look at, going to a flat 10% impervious with having that analysis completed. Maybe it's looking at, hey, what's your peak rate, doing? Is it changing? Because right now it just says demonstrate that there's no flood damage. It doesn't really offer up what does that mean exactly, right? But I want to use this idea as a way that, if you're gonna try to use 10% of your overall area, but you're potentially, increasing your peak flows too much or whatever that is, then that's where you're gonna need to look to reduce that. And so maybe that reduction isn't a full-blown detention basin, maybe it's incorporating a couple of BMPs that are easier to maintain than some bigger native area that get that job done. That's kind of what, and I think that would give the flexibility, and that's something that the ag side of the county has been looking for, is to have those options available to them to avoid detention basins. And it's a big part of the constituents that we have, and this was driven through one of the board members that's her district. And so, like I said, I just want to go through the process, really vet this, see if we can come up with something. Ultimately, if I have to report back to them and say, hey, we took a look at this, here's all the things that we looked at and did. Ultimately, we just couldn't find a way because here are the risks, and we either don't have the staff or we don't have a way to implement this and execute it cleanly. That might be the result, I don't know. So I love the input, and again, I want you guys to think about, don't direct it at me. I just want you guys to try to think about, how can we overcome some of these, things that you're bringing up. And I'd certainly love to explore those. So that's kind of, what I wanted to do with today's meeting.
My last thought is also looking into Boone and Winnebago counties. I've done detention in both counties 15, 20 years ago. It's been so long. I'd love to see, because we got part of our county draining through the Kishwaukee, through the Rock River. I know Rockford's got, it's more Rockford than just Winnebago, but they've got things in place. I don't remember if it was a 2-year storm, don't exceed it. I'd love to find out what they're currently doing now. Okay. And in Boone County, I know they're really lax, but maybe, like we said earlier, maybe we say whatever size acreages might be smaller sizes, we got a different set of rules for those, to where it's different than the larger subdivisions that can handle whether it's a release rate we're doing now or some variation. That we might come up with something different. I'm not saying, we have to apply that release rates that are really making our ponds big everywhere. But be curious to see what these, our western part of the county might kind of more as a flavor with those guys.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing with detention basins too is over time, if there's lack of maintenance, you're losing storage volume, right? You're losing that release rate capacity, they're overtopping more. So detention basins still are an issue as well, long-term, I would say. If they're not maintained, which if you're doing, there's some other options and we can provide guidance for that, then maybe that's going to be better.
Can we, in the evaluations for the ag properties, instead of native vegetation, can we look into the curve numbers of putting into hay or pasture land?
Yeah.
Also maybe adding cover crops into the cropping system, something a requirement that way, so that they're still able to get their income off of their property without converting it.
This would be limited to ag only?
I would say no. If you want to grow hay on
Well, but I mean,
Obviously, there's some unrealistic, there's gotta be some feasibility to it, but, from that perspective, no, I would, the idea would be that, and we could say for ag specifically, you could look at some different ag-type crops, and the NRCS has guidelines and things like that already outlined for a lot of that. So I would look to not reinvent the wheel on that aspect and just incorporate that to say an NRCS-approved practice or whatever that language looks like.
And spring to that comment. I know we took a lot of our lessons from living snow fences from states west of here, where it was more ag than, we're kind of a half-half county, half urban, half ag. So we may want to look to a little bit further west to get some.
Iowa has prairie strips and all that other kind of stuff.
Exactly, because they'd probably have more data on what runoff effect it has depending on the crop that you're going across. And Stoyan, one other thing.
Yes, I'm listening.
As far as looking at animals and pasturing, and I say this twofold. One, the discussion came up earlier. Two, you mentioned about the solar farms. Just realizing days of old, there were certain numbers, like they used to say 1 cow needs 2 acres if you're gonna let it feed. Because otherwise, it's gonna start eating out the roots and bare grounding everything. And to see it, all you have to do is drive by a feedlot and you'll see it's all bare earth. So as the solar farms and stuff start saying, oh, we're gonna put livestock on, make sure you don't over pasture it, because they're not gonna be throwing bales of hay to the animals.
Well, it's not all livestock, and, they're, like, those guys are coming in with very specific plans and outlines, guys. It's not like we're just, oh, this looks good. So if someone wants to do the same thing, they're gonna be held to those standards, and they're gonna have to make that decision that they wanna engage in that process and go through that. So I'm not worried, I'm not worried about that part, and I'm okay to make it as restrictive or non-restrictive or whatever makes sense with some safety factors built in. But I just, like I said, the ordinance, the way that it reads, you go from, okay, you need to slow down your release rate straight to a detention basin. It just, in
I understand.
2025, using, to Steve's point, the history of it, I just feel like that's why I want to look at it deeper. If it's opening up those release rates, then maybe that's ultimately all that we could come up with at the end of the day, so. But Spring, real quick, just to circle back, this is the TR 50, I don't know when the TR was made. These were the curve numbers. I pulled them from here, so you can see some row crops. I don't know, what the idea is, but again, when we run the calculations, for example, we know we might have some B and A type soils, but maybe for a safety factor, we don't go beyond the C, right? Or, whatever it is, and kind of think about it that way. To add some of those concerns of making sure that for the future, we're not creating a situation where we have to backpedal and I don't know, come in and fix the mess that we've made.
The curve number is the most powerful lever to pull in that equation for sure. So what we always had conversations with engineers that, let's say that the subdivision was a B soil and they come in and, you develop the entire thing, you mass grade it, and then the thing was, well, it's still B soil. No, it's not. It's a D soil now. You've compacted everything. So that was always the argument.
That's what we usually see with these subdivision designs. Everybody was using a curve number of 68. There's no way they're at a 68 after they're done. To your point, and especially like 20 years later, like today. So, but again, I feel like those are some of the things and some of the concern about that manipulation. Like at the end of the day, you have to do a tributary area. I don't know how much you can manipulate that thing to the point where you can get around it with the curve number. Again, if we put in the guardrails and say, if you're gonna be doing X, Y, and Z, into Spring's point, are you doing hay crops, are you doing whatever? We can define some of that, feel comfortable with it, figure out what makes sense. put that in, and now, you know, Dan is farming some hay instead of avoiding a 1 acre detention basin, for example. I don't know if that sounds good, Dan, but.
I wanna go back to your development scenario there, and.
You want me to pull something up?
How poor that land is when they get done with it.
Oh.
And detention ponds, which back in the day when I was involved in construction a long time ago, we called them retention ponds, and they held water. Why aren't we giving the developers the option to use those ponds, hold more water and use it for irrigation? Because it never fails, we get a 3-inch rain, and I've got water coming on my fields out of detention ponds. I go through the subdivision and people are watering their yards.
It's certainly something that people can take advantage of. Don't ask me. I would have to go ask the development community. I think at the end of the day, it's a cost thing, right? You just want to develop for as cheap as possible, make the most money, and you're not
But
necessarily.
they're pumping well water, and they could be using that water.
There's no restriction on that I know of.
No, if someone came in and
Of
said,
course,
hey,
now
we
we're
want
pouring
to
copper sulfate and all the herbicides in the ponds, and you would want to spray that on your plants, probably not.
What are you putting that in there for?
Kill the algae. And anything else, right? You may use another herbicide to kill cats. You might use another herbicide.
So,
I don't tell them to do it,
again,
it's just what happens.
This would probably combine with like the water quality stuff, the BMP stuff that we're trying to build on too, right? So everything would be connected, and that could be something that we look at. You know, we want to look at incentivizing, like if you wanted to put on rain barrels on your roof, and how does that factor in detention if you're able to capture a portion of that storm? Like, can you get a little bit of a reduction there, you know? So all these ideas can factor in if we move away a little bit from the idea of you're stuck in this box, you calculate your release rate, and then you have to detain for it. That's what essentially this does. It doesn't allow you to look at other elements of the site and specifics and, you know, capture some of those. And in some scenarios, it's not gonna work. You're gonna be forced to do the detention. But, yes.
Hey, I haven't been on the committee more recently, but previously we talked a lot about the farms. Typically it was the gravel that put them over. And I understand the compact gravel conversation, but a lot of these farms have lots of gravel that's not compacted. I mean, it's the line path or whatever is compact, but they have gravel around the machine sheds and other places that typically aren't. Is there any consideration for a percentage factor on that to maybe address the farm issue, and then it still addresses the development issue on the other side?
Well, you do have gravel, it comes in, like if you look at it this, like it comes in lower than straight
Not much.
concrete.
Not much, that's what I'm
right.
saying. It seems
So,
like,
but this is where we can factor it in, is in the curve numbers,
Yeah.
right? We can develop something if it's non-compacted. We certainly will entertain the option of infiltration there if the soils allow for it and things like that. Like I've told people, like, well, I'm just putting non-compacted gravel. Okay, well, show me what the underlying soils look like. So, point being that every situation is different. I think there has to be some level of analysis done to show that your particular development isn't going to cause or increase the runoff rate from your site. And if that is using other methodologies other than detention to accomplish that, that's really where I think we can go to and take the next chapter of, like, you know, thinking about this. When it makes sense, obviously, you would have to analyze the downstream. Are you in an area that is known to flood? You know, then that could look a little different. I also, you know, there's also an element to this that a lot of the urbanization was done prior to any of these ordinances. So now, are you asking new developers and people that develop to basically pay for the sins of the past as well because you know that there's issues?
What?
One thing I
Ask
guess-
MWRD.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Well,
That's what the ordinances are.
so, and again, if that's the conclusion we arrive to, I'll go to the board and I'll say, well, the tax said this.
You could put a parameter, like a legally non-conforming mark, and say, okay, subdivisions done prior to
Yeah,
1975, I mean, I'm throwing a number out there, should not be required to meet these points because they can't. Or it's logistically extremely
Well,
difficult.
keep in mind, so every study, right, is outdated. 95% of the infrastructure is under design that's in the ground. So these are all things that lawyers are just looking at when you design something nowadays, and I only say this because now I've been on 3 litigations for hurricanes where the rainfall is stupid, right? You can't design for that kind of scenario. And yet people are saying, well, you should have these overland flow routes designed for this. And it's like, you cannot design for those sorts of instances. And I just don't, I mean, I think you can do this stuff. You gotta have really, the guardrails, the caps, the limits. You gotta really be restrictive on how you put this together. Theoretically, I agree with you on everything you stated. It's just, it's a very slippery slope.
Well, I get that. So I guess that my next question is it worth going into further detail, and can we come up with a list of the constraints? Because there's been a lot, and I haven't been writing any of this stuff down. So can we kind of concentrate some of the major points, to think about it more and come back, and I would challenge you guys to, to think about it as well. And I can send the list out, we can send the list out after the meeting, or we'll make it into a nice Word doc for you guys or whatever. And, again, I don't know, I mean, April 8th is coming up, so that might be too soon. We'll see what other things, we're dealing with to put on the agenda, but this is one of the last kind of remaining bigger items that we have, along with the downstream detention security bond thing. We're working on that, so we're gonna provide language for that, but at this point. So if that makes sense, then we want to do that, then let's head in that direction. See if we can overcome these hurdles, figure out the ones we can, which ones we can't, why we can't, and have an actual analysis and be able to, so I can report back to my committee.
I think it's a path worth going down and exploring the options. I definitely think that that's something that's a worthwhile process.
And Brian, to your point, I do want to say that what we're looking to develop with our watershed plans is have studies where we can look at future scenarios. What does maybe increased precipitation look like, continued development? What do those inundation maps look like? If we're headed down that path, we also want to model, can we fine tune those release rates to help, keep those current flood levels that we're at either improved or static. And so with that comes, we're looking to figure out if we're going to need a rain gauge data network. Talk to your, I don't know if you mentioned, but, or using NOAA data. Is that, are we able to use the NOAA data and look at our groundwater monitoring system? And is that pretty accurate? So now we can have a way to track this stuff and see how we're doing every 5 to 10 years and figure out for different watersheds, okay, this one is getting towards that higher risk. So we need to impose a release rate requirement on it. And maybe by doing that, it removes some of these options because of the way that development has just accelerated there. Or maybe we know that we're doing that, maybe we want to reanalyze that watershed because now we've incorporated a lot more green infrastructure and alternative ideas. Are we worse off than we were? Understanding that maybe we have high precipitation rates and things like that are driving most of this, but, so there is this idea that we should be able to track that and be able to plan for it instead of just, well, it was done 30 years ago, and they're using curve numbers of 68, and that's no longer really how it works. Maybe at that time, and maybe we're at that forefront where fast forward 30 years, they're gonna look at us like, what the heck were those guys thinking? I don't know. Or maybe we did a good job.
So when Illinois State Water Survey presented Bulletin 75 at the IASMA conference, you guys remember that? They were very clear that they wanted to use, like, because they saw a trend line of the rainfall going up like this.
Right.
They wanted to use up here projected future rainfall, but instead they were politically stuck with having to use old rainfall. So I don't know, maybe that's a good starting point because they actually did it. They have it all.
We're in talks with them to do that. That's exactly what we're talking about, Jody. And so then if we have a rain gauge network, or if we're able to use the NOAA data, because that lines up fairly well with how it's done, then we can see where we're at on that curve, right? Are we on that upper end? And that's where we're staying. And then, hey, we want these watersheds are the most vulnerable. This is what we're seeing. We should go to these more restrictive release rates in these areas because of that concern, and unfortunately, that might remove some of the options off the table. Because at the end of the day, you gotta factor in, big picture stuff, and I get that. I do. So, all right, let's wrap up. So if we can, or maybe I'll just go back, but I don't know, some of the ideas. Some of my engineers in the room, is there concern for like manipulating the data? I think that was a big one, right? That how are we gonna come?
Well, not the data, I think it's different ways of doing the
The
calculations.
calculations, okay. And just, I don't know, shout out stuff at me, because I was not writing that down. Anything else, concerns? I think it was long-term maintenance, right?
Well, I think whatever you make the ordinance to be in the future, you're gonna have people trying to manipulate it to their advantage. So if it's maintaining existing, that's a very innocuous type of thing. But with these numbers, that's a hard number. You know what 0.15 CFS types of disturbed area is, or times the impervious area. But anything else where you're trying to just match things together and figure out curve numbers and, whether something's been compacted and what percentage is compacted, and what if they de-plow it and they uncompact it later. You're just gonna have a lot of different things that you're gonna need to go through, as part of reviewing things. It's gonna make it difficult. That's the way it is in Texas right now. So, I mean,
I heard it's better there than the rest of the country.
It is for developers.
Well, how about this? How about staff will come up with some 2 to 3 scenarios for you guys, and then you guys can nitpick it. So we'll plan for some of this, and you guys can nitpick at it, and we'll see what your comments are. Because I feel like there's just too much for me to write down and a lot of different items. Does that sound like a reasonable next step?
On that same line, did you want any of us to submit comments to you, or is that going to just overwhelm you and that's not fair?
Well, I mean, obviously, anyone here, if you have feedback that you want to share with me, yes, give it to me, email it to me separately. Don't include the group because I think we'll break Robert's rules. So just email me directly. And then in the meantime, I'll try to come up with some of these scenarios, work them out a little bit more, and say, okay, here's, kind of like you're back in school, here's your proposed conditions, I'm gonna build X, Y, and Z. So in order to deal with that, here's some of the calculations, here's my proposed development, here's my maintenance plan, or whatever. I'll go through the whole step. Maybe I'll do depending on how much time I can get, I'm out next week, some of you are too. Maybe I'll cancel the April 8th meeting, shift it to May, just to give myself a little more time to give you guys at least 2 examples. Then that way I can start jotting things down on where it goes wrong, other ideas, etc. Does that work?
Might just do that now, make that decision now.
What?
Do you want a motion to just strike the April 8th meeting?
Do you guys want to do that? It would help me out a lot.
I'll make the motion to strike the April
I'll
8th
second
meeting.
All right. Okay.
All in favor?
All right. Yeah. Hold on, let me make sure Lily got that motion. Lily was to cancel the April 8th by Tyler, seconded by Al. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. We'll,
We have our May date already.
it should just be, it's already the second Tuesday. Should already be on there, so. All right, so I'll try to come up with 2 good scenarios for you guys. We can nitpick it and come back. All right, there's no reports, any future topics, announcements from anyone? Do I hear a motion to adjourn?